Lord God, we thank you for the privilege of having heaven's door open to us as John sees in and records what he sees, Lord, so we too get this sneak preview of both the activity and the setting, the drama of heaven. Lord, please keep us alert for this next 25 minutes. Would you tune our minds and, more importantly, our hearts and our entire lives, Lord, over to you, that we would want to hear you speak to us and that we would be responding in faith. Amen. Music has a powerful way of stirring the emotions that spoken word by itself just can't do. Take Elton John's song, Candle in the Wind. You may remember that at Princess Diana's funeral all those years ago, he rewrote the song as a dedication, as a tribute to her. And while he was singing it on the piano in Westminster Abbey, with a limited number of people there, the cameras would pan out to outside Buckingham Palace, where thousands upon thousands of people were just weeping. Such was the effect that the song and Princess Diana's legacy had upon people. Music has that way of reaching the emotions that in some ways spoken word can't do. Or take songs at sporting occasions, for example. Wales aren't just the most reliable team at winning the Six Nations, they always win the Six Nations singing contest, even when there's no crowds. Right? If you watch them during the national anthems, they're gripping their badge, and you look at the emotion on their faces, they are passionate. Music, singing has this way of reaching emotions that in some way spoken word can't do. Songs about heaven aren't in short supply either. A more recent one had the really catchy title, Heaven is a Halfpipe, with the equally catchy line of, if I die before I wake, at least in heaven I can skate. I'm not sure about the accuracy, but it's catchy, isn't it? Back in the 1980s and the 1990s, there were songs from Belinda Carlisle with Heaven is a Place on Earth, or Bryan Adams with the simple title, Heaven. And both those songs were looking at, love, the intimacy of love, and love really being what heaven is about. But if we come at it from the other direction, heaven isn't short of a song or two either. Last week in chapter 4 of Revelation, we saw two songs sung by the living creatures and the 24 elders, creation and the new creation. And here we have in chapter 5 two more songs, this time not directed towards God as the creator, but towards the Son, Jesus, as the Redeemer. But where heaven's songs differ from their earthly counterparts is that their lyrics convey magnificent true realities, not human speculation based on feelings. And the repeated chorus of heaven from chapter 5 is, worthy is the Lamb who was slain. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. But it seems a bit of a strange line, doesn't it? Just come out of your church bubble for a moment. Pretend that you've never heard that before and you don't know anything about this book of Revelation. And here is a song of praise in heaven to a lamb, to a baby sheep. And we're saying worthy. Well, what's worthy about this baby sheep? Why a lamb? Why are we singing praises to a lamb? More than that, why sing praise to a lamb that looks as though it's dead? It just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, does it? But then when we remember that Revelation is vision and symbolism, and we realize that we then begin to realize that the focus of heaven's song is not actually a lamb, but Jesus, the risen Lord, who looks as though he's the lamb who's been slaughtered. It's taking us back to the prophet Isaiah, where Jesus, the suffering servant, is prophesied, the one who would be led like a lamb to the slaughter, speaking of his crucifixion. And so really the song is not about a pathetic weak lamb at all, but a wonderfully crucified Messiah. Some of you may remember Larry Norman, the US singer, who wonderfully wanted to redeem rock and roll music in the 1970s. Well, after his first song, Why Should the Devil Have All the Fun? Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music? He wrote a song called Outlaw, which asked the question, who is Jesus? These are some of the words. Some say he was an outlaw that roamed across the land. Some say he was a poet, that he'd stand upon the hill, that his voice could calm an angry crowd and make the waves stand still. Some say he was a sorcerer, a man of mystery. Some say he was a politician who spoke of being free. Some say he was the Son of God, a man above all men, that he came to be a servant and to set us free. Larry Norman raises the million-dollar question, both then and now. Who is Jesus, and what's your response to him? But it's not just a philosophical question, it's the most personal of all questions, because of the implications that come from it. And what Revelation 5 is going to do is give us heaven and the Bible's final answer to that question. Who is Jesus, and what should my response to him be? Well, let's look at the drama of Revelation 5 and see heaven's answer unfold. But actually, heaven doesn't begin with an answer, but it begins with a question. In fact, it begins with a problem, and we can see that problem in verses 1 to 4. As John continues his vision of seeing into heaven, he now sees a scroll in God's right hand. And we're told that it's covered on both sides, that it's complete. And it has 7 seals on it, wrapped around it, to prevent it from being opened, to prevent the contents of this scroll being revealed, until the one with the right qualifications can step forward. But look at verse 3, because we're told that no one is worthy. John looked all around heaven. He looked upon the earth and under the earth, and no one could be found who was worthy to open this scroll. It's not that people weren't powerful enough, or they weren't clever enough, or intellectually enough people. It wasn't that there weren't strong enough people. No, the problem is that there was no one worthy enough, no one with the right qualifications to open and reveal the contents of this scroll. Let's pause in that drama for a moment, because we need to understand what this scroll is. Why is this scroll so important that it's going to cause John to weep when no one can be found worthy enough to open it? Well, the scroll represents God's purposes for salvation and judgment, for blessing and redemption and justice. The imagery comes from the prophet Ezekiel in the Old Testament, where God tells Ezekiel to eat and to swallow a scroll which would contain God's words. And it would be God's words of blessing and judgment upon the nation of Israel. This is no small-scale plan that's about to be revealed. No, this is God's purposes for all people, for all time. And as we come into chapter 6 of Revelation, and we see that next week, they will begin to be revealed and actioned. We'll see that the scroll open stands for God's purposes for all nations, from John's day through to Jesus' return. And of course, that includes us here today, doesn't it? This scroll is going to include God's purposes for salvation and justice and redemption today. But as long as that scroll remains sealed, none of that can be revealed. God's will, God's plan for the nations can't be known. Heaven needs one who can execute God's will, one who can see the commands and bring them to pass. My all-time favorite comedy is Only Fools and Horses. And in one of the final episodes, Del Boy, one of the central characters, is given this letter. Actually, that's a bit of a lie. He's given a multitude of letters, each one from a solicitor's. And as he knows, as always, he owes multiple thousands of pounds to the taxman, and he knows that his flat that he lives in is about to be evicted from, he decides the best policy here is simply to ignore the letters. Well, that is until his wife Raquel and brother Rodney see this pile of letters stacking up. Well, after the unsurprising arguments that follow, the next scene takes us to the solicitor's office, where Del Boy and Rodney are sitting before the solicitor, awaiting the announcement. Just tell us how much we owe. Just tell us when the eviction notice now is going to come to pass. But to their surprise, to their wonderful surprise, the solicitor has good news for them. He's actually brought them there for the reading of Uncle Albert's will, for the execution of that will to take place. And the great news is that Albert had left enough money for them not to be evicted from the flat. The solicitor could see the commands of the person making the will and, equally importantly, make it come to pass. But John in heaven sees no one like that. No one is worthy enough to reveal and execute God's purposes. And so his response is to weep. Put yourself into John's situation at the time. Actually, put yourself into the situation of some of the churches in the world that are suffering great persecution today, for it's the same. Both then and now we see Christians who are both prisoners and partners in the suffering for Jesus' sake, and know full well of state-led persecution against God and his church. For John in his day, death had already come to some, and for others, death was just around the corner. The last 2,000 years shows us that nothing has changed. Death remains for many Christians. Well, if God's will can't be revealed and executed, then the persecuted church in all generations have absolutely no assurance of their salvation. They can have no assurance that justice will be served for the perpetrators of evil. For faithful Christians all over the world who've given up family, who've given up friends, who've given up a home, their careers to follow Jesus. If God's will can't be opened and therefore executed, we have no assurance that any of that is worth it. If this scroll can't be opened, we might as well pack up and go home, because we have no assurance of our salvation. When we begin to see it like that, weeping is the right response, isn't it? For God's will not to be executed would be a tragedy on a scale far grander than the tragedy that COVID has been for the last year and a half. No wonder John wept. So here is heaven's problem. Where is the one worthy enough to open the scroll? Or secondly, let's look at heaven's solution. And let's come back to the drama. Let's look at chapter 5 and verse 5, because here we begin magnificently to see the answer to the problem. Then one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals." John goes from bitter despair to being comforted. Why? Because one has now been found. Not the clever one, not the intellectual one, not the powerful or the strong one, but the one worthy enough has been found. Jesus, the prophesied lion-like king from Judah, from the Old Testament tribe of Judah. The one in the line of great King David. He is the one who is worthy to open the scroll. But look at the paradox as well, because that's not all, is there? Because this king, this magnificent king, is also, strangely, the lamb who was slain. The lamb who is the king is worthy to reveal and execute God's will. But what is it that makes him worthy? If it's not power or strength or cleverness, what is it? Well, look at the verse. Look at verse 5 again. He's worthy because he's triumphed. He has conquered. Now here we're not specifically told what he's triumphed over. But as the book of Revelation goes on, it becomes clear. He's triumphed over Satan. He's triumphed over sin and sin's best friend, death. All that has been conquered by Jesus. Death has its grip on us because of sin, and that makes us slaves to the slave master, Satan. But Jesus, we're told, has conquered this. He has triumphed over this. But the way of triumph was not by military might. It wasn't by sending out an army. Anything but. The way of triumph was by becoming the slain lamb. By giving up his own life on the cross, he triumphed over, paradoxically, sin, death, and Satan. God's suffering servant led like a lamb to the slaughter, like we see in Isaiah 53. That's the means of victory. His substitutionary death brings us life. On the cross, a swap took place, him for us, so that we might not need to face death. It's the abject humility of the cross through the path of suffering, rejection, and death that Jesus has now conquered all enemies. We're used to having symbols to represent nations, aren't we? The US, we know, has the bald-headed eagle. Russia, the bear. The British Isles has the lion. But look at the symbol. Look at the symbol here. All those speak of power. But the symbol for the church is the lamb. It's weakness, isn't it? But it's power through weakness. Because as well as Jesus being the lamb that was slain, he's also the lion, the king from the tribe of Judah. We can't have one without the other. The crown and the cross go together. Suffering and glory go together for Jesus. Maybe it sounds crazy. A slain dead lamb triumphing over Satan and his human agents. For the early church, being told that this slain lamb, Jesus, is your path to victory, that he will protect you from the enemies of Satan and death. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? But time and time again, God says, that's the way. That's the way to victory. Victory comes through the path of apparent weakness. Because Jesus is not just the lamb, but also the lion. It's the paradox at the heart of the gospel. A crucified Messiah who is also the powerful king, who will reign forever, but only after suffering the agonies of Calvary. Last Saturday commemorated 76 years since victory in Europe Day from the Second World War, where Germany unconditionally surrendered all its weapons. The turning point of the war. Many would argue that had taken place on the 6th of June the year before, 1944, on D-Day, when the Allied forces, both of the air and the sea, landed on the Normandy beaches and began the bringing back of the land of France. This two-part victory of the war is also a great picture of the two-part victory of Christ. The cross stands as the climax of history. The cross stands as the turning point on the war against sin and death and Satan. And at his return, the final defeat of those enemies will be seen. God's future purposes of salvation, blessing, justice, and redemption, the defeat of Satan, all will be finalized at Jesus' return, because he's been the slain lamb that died on the cross for us. The cross at the center of history is the deal breaker of all deal breakers, for it allows us to be freed from the grip of Satan and his human agents, his human forces of sin and death. Brother, sister, we need not fear the future. Whatever might come to us, we have no need of fear, because the decisive victory has been won at the cross. So we've seen heaven's problem. We've seen heaven's solution. Thirdly, let's look at heaven's worship. This is the response to the solution, the response to Jesus being the lion and the lamb, heaven's worship. It's the right response, isn't it? When we realize how magnificent Jesus is, when we realize how magnificent his victory is, to cry out in adoration is the right thing to do. Just like in chapter 4, it's the same people, isn't it? The living creatures and the 24 elders bursting out in song, creation and new creation, praising God not now for being the creator, but praising the Son for being the Redeemer. And it's not just a few people from the home counties either, isn't it? Look down. Look down at verse 9. You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain. With your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation. It's not just a few people from Bedford, is it? It's not a few more people from the rest of the UK. This is people from absolutely everywhere. Not just every country, but every tribe within the country, and then every language within those tribes. People from all those walks of life are now in heaven and will continue to be in heaven, worshipping Jesus for what he's done on the cross. It's magnificent, isn't it? It should lead our own hearts to well up in joy and praise. And it should remind us of the faithfulness of God. Because those words come from near the beginning of salvation history, where God came and spoke to an old man Abraham and to his barren wife, and said, from you will come offspring that will be as many as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. And here we are now at the end of salvation history, seeing exactly that. So not only should we be praising Jesus for being our Redeemer, but God for his faithfulness through redemption history. It's a magnificent God whom we worship. And that right response is to well up in praise, which of course is why after we've had this sermon, we'll go outside and do exactly that. It's the only appropriate response. So when we come to singing, let's not do so half-heartedly. Let's not sort of sing with our lips, but really our minds are thinking about lunch, or it's a bit chilly today, or I wonder what we're going to do this afternoon. The comprehensiveness of the victory of Jesus should cause us to sing out in praise with full hearts, with lips, minds, and hearts all focused on our wonderful Redeemer. And as we do so, we're not just a few people singing God's praises here. We're joining with the assemblies of heaven, with the 24 elders and the living creatures, because day and night they never cease to sing these songs. So we're not just a few people singing. We're part of a ginormous collective assembly singing praises to Jesus. Surely that should excite us a little bit more. So heaven's problem, heaven's solution, heaven's worship, and then finally, an earthly response. I want to end with two applications for us in the here and now. Firstly, because Jesus suffered, his people are called to suffer. While there was a uniqueness in the suffering of Jesus, for his suffering alone redeems us from an empty life, nevertheless, his suffering is also a prototype. It's the first of many. He suffered, therefore we too are going to be called to suffer. Cast your minds back to the Gospels. Cast your mind back to the middle point of the Gospel, where Jesus comes to Peter and says, hey, Peter, who do people say that I am? And Peter replies. And then Jesus says, Peter, what about you? Who do you say I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ, you're the Son of God. And we want to go, yes, Peter, at last you've got it. And then Jesus says to him, Peter, if anyone would be my follower, if anyone would come after me, he must pick up his cross. What's Jesus saying? If you want to be his follower, you've got to count the cost. You've got to be prepared to suffer. Jesus' suffering was the first of many. It's the prototype. And if we're not willing to count the cost, if we're not willing to suffer, then really we're not Jesus' people. Jesus suffered, his people are called to suffer. Perhaps then it's not surprising that the very next part of Revelation, chapter 6, gives us another glimpse into heaven. But this time it's the martyrs, those who've died proclaiming Christ as Lord. But note where they are. Those who've suffered are with Jesus in heaven. So if we know that this is the path to glory, we'll not see suffering as something to avoid. We'll not see suffering as outside of God's will for me. Far from it. And therefore we'll see our sufferings in the light of Jesus' sufferings. And that will help us to endure it. So our first earthly response, because Jesus suffered, his people are called to suffer. And then secondly, the model for ministry is power through weakness. The model for ministry is power through weakness. When we put these two scenes of chapters 4 and 5 together of Revelation, this paradox of power through weakness becomes clear. In chapter 4, we've seen one seated on a throne, powerful, glorious, and the throne dominates the vision. And the throne as a metaphor speaks of power, of rule, of authority and control. Yet at the heart of chapter 5, the vision is not the throne, but the lamb, the weak slain lamb. A pathetic slain-looking lamb. The contrast with power could not be greater. Power and weakness, or more precisely power through weakness, dramatized in God on the cross and the Lamb on the throne, lies at the heart of ultimate reality. It even lies at the heart of the mystery of God himself. Therefore, the model for us, the pattern for all gospel service for ministry, is to follow this path, power through weakness. We will be people who live lives demonstrating that. We'll be living lives demonstrating forgiveness, grace, compassion, mercy, self-sacrifice, humility. That doesn't speak of power, does it? And we'll do that firstly towards each other in the church, and then we'll be demonstrating those lives to those outside the church. As we reach out, for example, through the cafe and through your own individual witness, we won't win people for Christ by beating them into submission, or clever apologetic arguments, or grumbly thrusting a cup of tea under their nose. No, instead, the way of the cross, the way of power in weakness, is to be servants who are Christ-like, people who are loving, people who are building relationships with people, while also accepting that rejection may come along the way. But we'll act like that. We'll act in self-sacrifice, in humility, in love, in compassion and forgiveness, knowing all the time that this apparently foolish message of weakness, of a lamb upon the cross, is really a message of great power, because it's the only way, the only message that brings life where there is death. Let's pray. Jesus, you are the Lamb upon the throne. Lord, thank you so much that you are willing to bear our sin, to take the hit for us. Lord, there's nothing good about ourselves that is warranting of eternal life ourselves. We don't deserve your love. We don't deserve your redemption, but in your mercy, in your forgiveness, in your grace, you have lavished it upon us through the cross. Lord, help us to model that sacrificial love to others too. Amen. If you'd like to head outside, and we'll continue with our worship out there.